The Trials of Rumpole by John Mortimer. Rumpole and the Age for Retirement. Sir Matthew told the Police Federation that the work of crime detection was becoming more and more frustrating. And when you catch them, he said, there's always some clever dick of a bent barrister who earns his living by finding a legal loophole for the crook to wriggle through. The wireless set in the kitchen at Casa Rumpole, where I was moodily chewing a slice of burnt toast and drinking a cup of instant before setting off for the Ludgate Circus Palais de Justice, crackled with indignation. And as I went for the ancient hat and well-used mackintosh, I heard that Sir Matthew had regretted, as he called it, the recent serious epidemic of acquittals at the Old Bailey, which was a glaring example of the injustice caused by underworld legal vultures. Oh dear, and a very big oh dear at that. Rumpole's occupation, that of making sure that citizens of all classes are not randomly convicted of crimes they didn't do, just so that the prison statistics may look more impressive, seems to have fallen into disrepute. I felt more than usually unappreciated as I burrowed down the Gloucester Road tube on my mole-like journey to irritate the constabulary and pour sand in the gearbox of justice, and when I emerged blinking into the daylight of the Temple station, I was beginning to wonder if it were not time to abandon the uphill struggle. Was it possible that Rumpole should retire from the bar? Of course, I have nothing to retire on, except an overdraft at the National Westminster Bank and a dribble of uncollected fees. But now my son Nick has gone off to seek a newer world, being something pretty high up, in the University of Baltimore Sociology Department, and living with his wife Erica in some luxurious ranch-style edifice, with a swimming pool in what my daughter-in-law mysteriously refers to as the backyard. I always thought of a backyard as a place for dustbins, bicycles, and possibly a cage for ferrets. Hilda and I are more or less alone in the world. "It little profits that an idle king," I quoted to myself as I climbed into the frayed black gown and crowned myself with the antique wig, and poor old Alfred Tennyson's words seemed more than usually apposite. "By this still hearth among these barren crags, matched with an aged wife, I mete and dole unequal laws unto a savage race, that hoard and feed and sleep, and know not me." I recalled the poor old laureate's words again that day when, delivered of my final speech in a case where I was defending a certain Melvyn Glassworth on a well-aimed charge of conspiracy to steal various works of art and valuable antiques, I sat in No. 3 Court at the Old Bailey listening to the summing up of that singularly unattractive judge, Mr. Justice Vosper. Just as a gambler at Monte Carlo may be bankrupted by a long run on the black, when all his savings are staked on the red, so I had suffered the misfortune of facing Vosper J. in 3 cases running at the Bailey. This judge, who in my considered opinion has a great deal in common with Shakespeare's Angelo, they both urinate congealed ice, suffered all the worst faults of a judge. He was unable to keep quiet, he invariably acted as leading counsel for the prosecution, and he could never resist trying to make a joke, instead of leaving the comedy to Rumpole. Anyway, there we sat, counsel for the prosecution relaxed, the jury looking young and serious. They had all no doubt heard the wise words of the head copper on the wireless that morning, and Mr. Melvyn Glassworth, a plumpish, pinkish man who smelt of various toilet preparations, sweated slightly in the dock as he saw the doors of the prison-house begin to close. I shut my eyes, and from afar became aware that the words now falling from his lordship might be construed as discouraging Rumpole's continued activity about the courts of justice. "Finally, members of the jury, allow me to remind you," said his lordship, "you decide this case on the facts and not on the speeches of counsel, however eloquently they address you." In other words, his message was, beware of Rumpole, the Old Bailey hack. "Counsel for the defence in this case," the judge went on, "has chosen to challenge the police evidence as he is entitled to do. But you are entitled to form your own view of the evidence, quite independent of the view of learned counsel, however long he may have been practising at the bar. Well, why didn't he just tell them Rumpole's past it? We all enjoy Rumpole's speeches. We always find his little jokes most amusing. But you and I have a more serious duty to perform. I knew he was delighted that I was only there to provide light relief. Bring on the dancing Rumpole. Of course, if by any chance you think there is a reasonable doubt in this case, you will follow Mr. Rumpole's advice and acquit the defendant Glassworth of this serious charge of conspiracy to steal these valuable works of art. Here his lordship smiled tolerantly at the jury, in the full knowledge that they would agree that this was a truly laughable suggestion. But if you think that the prosecution case is unanswerable, in other words, Vosper J. was saying, if you have an ounce of common sense, then it is your plain duty, in accordance with your oath, to find the defendant guilty as charged. And bugger Rumpole, he might have added. So will you please go now and consider your verdict? The only question for you is whether Melvyn Glassworth is guilty as charged. Mr. Jury Bailiff? Whereupon the usher rose in the well of the court, held up a Bible, and swore to take the jury to some convenient place to consider this simple question, and I prayed silently that they would consider the feelings of an old man and stay out for a decent interval, or at least more than 5 minutes. Meanwhile, I went out into the corridor, lit a small cigar with the nervous hand and the dry mouth I always experience when the jury goes out to consider its verdict, and was immediately accosted by a bulky man of about my own age, wearing a lightweight checked summer sports jacket, who addressed me in a low, rumbling, transatlantic accent. "Mr. Rumpole," he said, "I've heard a lot about you, sir. Your fame has spread to the States." "Oh, I can't believe it." "Oh, yes, sir. You know I practiced as an attorney myself for many years. Of course, I didn't wear the rug." I thought he must be referring to some sort of plaid, perhaps for use in cold courts, and I was confused. "The what?" The headpiece, the horsehair peruke." "Oh, this!" I slapped my antique wig. "Oh, of course we're invisible without it. Unless we've got it on, the judge can't see us. Sometimes I'm tempted to remove the wig and disappear entirely from view." "I can understand, sir, exactly how you feel." Voice was sympathetic. "The learned judge seemed to regard you somewhat as a senior citizen." "I'm not all that senior." I was defensive. "And he's not all that learned. I long ago gave up the dust of conflict for the groves of academe." "What do you call an academic lawyer here?" As bad language is not encouraged from members of my learned profession round the Bailey, I didn't tell him. In the ensuing silence he pulled out his wallet and presented me with an embossed card. "Professor Kramer, head of the Department of Law," it announced, "in the University of Baltimore." "Baltimore! My son's university!" But the usher came bustling up to put an end to further inquiry. "Mr. Rumpole," he said urgently. "They're coming back, Mr. Rumpole." How extremely rude of them. I turned to Professor Kramer. "My son Nick's at Baltimore, teaching sociology. He's got his own small department now, and a new house. 1106 East Drive, Baltimore. Do you know it?" "Of course, Nick's the brain of the family." "They've got a verdict, Mr. Rumpole," the usher returned. Look, I've got to go now. Professor, Kramer, Julius Kramer. I shall be in touch. Back to the dust of battle, Mr. Rumpole. I have to tell you, it's just great to be out of it." The jury came back and announced their unanimous decision. The judge announced the 3-year sentence he'd been planning throughout the trial, and I went down to the cells to say good-bye to Mr. Melvyn Glassworth. Taking a leave of a convicted client is one of those awkward social occasions which I would give anything to avoid, but which are as mandatory as an invitation to the palace. Not that I've ever had an invitation to the palace, but I have kept many disappointed engagements down the cells at the Bailey. However disastrous the result, or excessive the sentence, you rarely get blamed for losing a case. The prisoner may be almost relieved that it wasn't as bad as he feared, and is always numb. It's only after a week in chokey that the shock wears off, the pain starts, and the customer faces up to the reality of stone walls and banging up, and stinking chamber pots, and tears, I have no doubt, start to prick behind the eyes. As I have said, you rarely get blamed. Mr. Melvyn Glassworth was, however, the exception that proves the rule. When my solicitor, Mr. Bernard, and I went down to the cells, Glassworth was red-faced, sweating more than ever, and extremely angry. It was no good suggesting that 3 years for a theft worth at least 20,000 nicker was not outrageous. So Rumpole lit a small cigar and contented himself into looking genuinely grieved. Mr. Bernard provided cold comfort by pointing out that it was only 2, really, with time off for good behaviour. "Oh, what's 2? A long weekend in the country. Is that what you're trying to tell me? I suppose you want me to be grateful." Mr. Glassworth mopped his forehead with a purple silk handkerchief that smelt of old pear-drops. "I'm a man of a certain fastidiousness," he told us. "I have to have 2 shirts a day, me. 2 clean shirts is not an indulgence as far as I'm concerned. It's a necessity." Do they still have slopping out?" "Yes, I'm afraid they do," I had to tell him. He moved away from us. I was afraid that the tears were coming now. "I have spent my life in the acquisition of beautiful objects," Mr. Glassworth said. That, of course, was really the problem. "Slopping out! How can I live through it, me?" he went on. "And the sickening sexual advances of beefy warders." "Oh, I shouldn't count on that, old darling," I said, not quite sufficiently under my breath. "What did you say?" Nothing. I'm sorry." "You're sorry? You can go home." Mr. Glassworth's misery exploded in anger. "Have a bath with a decent tablet of imperial leather. Dry on a warm fleecy towel. Use talcum powder and eau de toilette, you." "Well, I don't, actually. But there was no real point in establishing my bathroom habits." "Attacking the police. That wasn't a smash hit with the jury, was it? And those little jokes in your final speech. They didn't exactly bring the house down, did they?" "The judge went too far in his summing up, Melvyn. We can think about an appeal." Mr. Bernard was soothing, but Melvyn Glassworth turned on me, unappeased. "Do you know what you ought to be thinking about, you? Retirement," he said. "That's what you ought to do. Bloody retire!" My next appearance before Mr. Justice Vosper took place after old Uncle Percy Timpson found Jesus Christ unexpectedly in his lock-up garage. I have written elsewhere of the Timpson family, that huge clan of South London villains whose selfless devotion to crime has kept the Rumpoles in such luxuries as vim, gumption, sliced bread, and saucepan scourers over the years, not to mention the bare necessities of life, such as gin, tonic, and cooking claret from Pomeroy's wine bar. Uncle Percy Timpson, who lived with his wife Noreen in a respectable semi-detached somewhere in the general direction of Kent, had practised for many years the profession of a small-time fence or receiver of stolen property. The business was small, personal, and regular. It enabled Uncle Percy and Auntie Noreen to run an elderly Cortina, grow prize leeks, and go for an annual holiday on the Costa Brava. They had, it seemed, recently been away for such a package adventure, and the morning after their return, as they sat brewing early morning tea in their kitchen, Auntie Noreen saw something which caused her to throw the fine Georgian silver teapot she was using, part of the business stock, straight into the tidy bin. When Percy joined her at the window, he said, "That new one. That Detective Inspector Broom's got no bloody manners." When it was old Percival White's batch, he at least gave you time to finish your breakfast. Detective Inspector Broom, known as the New Broom among the disapproving Timpsons, was a young, zealous officer with horn-rimmed spectacles, a small but aggressive moustache, and views on lawyers which coincided entirely with those which Sir Matthew, the chief copper, had been expounding on steam radio. He was at that moment advancing remorselessly on Uncle Percy's garage, leading a posse which included Detective Constable Wood, a uniformed officer, and an Alsatian dog. At the garage doors, old Uncle Percy came out in his dressing-gown and encountered the detective inspector. His conscience was easy, and his manner relaxed. So far as he knew, there was nothing of interest to be found in the garage. The load from the Deptford job went the week before, and a consignment of electric blankets was not due till the following Saturday. "You're interested in Bar My Banger, Mr. Broom, are you?" Percy asked. "One owner. He was a vicar of Gravesend. He only used it for funerals." "Open up, Percy." D.C. Wood sounded distinctly hostile. "Or do you want us to break the door down?" "We know what you've got there, Percy. We know exactly what you've got," D.I. Broom said. "Nothing. I do assure you, Mr. Broom, that's not perfectly legitimate." At which, with a confidence which turned out to be ill-founded, Percy Timpson unlocked his garage. A huge religious picture, which had been leaning against the door, toppled forward. Our Lord and Saviour, his hand raised in gentle benediction, was descending on the astonished onlookers. "Jesus Christ!" said Percy. He was more surprised than anyone. So it happened that Percy Timpson found himself in the local nick, being interviewed by those fearless battlers against crime, D.I. Broom and D.C. Wood. Broom, in the interest of making his case barrister-proof, was after Uncle Percy's autograph on a confession statement, a brief admission of the crime of receiving a religious artwork in his lock-up garage, well knowing it to have been stolen. Meanwhile, Mr. Bernard, the solicitor, who shared with me the honour of being permanent legal adviser to the Timpsons, had dropped in on Noreen in answer to her almost hysterical calls, a hysteria brought about by the supernatural quality of the manifestation in the garage, rather than by the everyday occurrence of Uncle Percy being taken down to the nick. "Percy's got too old for it, Mr. Bernard," she told him, over a nice cup of tea from the rescued Georgian silver pot. "The whole family told him. He's got too old altogether. He ought to retire. Fancy keeping Jesus in his lock-up garage. He's getting that careless." "Well, not sufficiently careless, let's hope, Mrs. Timpson, to give D.I. Broom his autograph," at which point Bernard managed to get hold of the detective inspector on the phone. The answers he got were only to be expected. Mr. Broom was unable to say where Percy Timpson was being held incommunicado. All he could say was that he was not prepared to let Percy see or speak to or have any dealings with a lawyer, for the reason, which seemed good enough to the D.I., that if Percy were guilty he'd only be stopped confessing, and if he were innocent, why did he need a lawyer anyway? Having satisfactorily disposed of the legal profession, Broom returned to where Percy was sitting being fed tea and biscuits by D.C. Wood, playing the sympathetic role, and briskly informed him that his wife Noreen was in the cells below about to be charged with conspiracy to receive Jesus, unless Percy at once supplied his autograph. The fact that this statement was an outrageous lie was merely one of the sacrifices the eager inspector was prepared to make in his devoted pursuit of law and order. "Tell me," Broom speculated, "just how long is it since your old woman saw the inside of Holloway?" "We want a statement signed in your own words, Percy." What were his own words, exactly? Constable Wood read out the composition on which he had been working. "I received the religious artwork in my garage, well knowing it to be stolen by a person whose name I am not prepared to divulge." "Well, which of them was it, Percy? Which of the Timpson family was it exactly?" Broom asked. "I am not prepared to divulge." Although prepared to do almost anything to save Noreen, Percy was not by nature a grass, any more than he was a signer of confessions. "No doubt on the advice of his bloody lawyer," Broom commented. "I was intending to dispose of this picture at the earliest opportunity," Wood read on, and Percy interrupted. "Like when I went up to King's Elm Saturday and met a few of my contacts. I want that in." "Like when I went up the King's Elm Saturday and met a few of my contacts," Wood read on obediently. And then the document, calculated to stop the boldest, bentest barrister dead in his tracks, was put before Uncle Percy for signature. So, when the brief arrived at my chambers, I was faced with a clearly signed confession of guilt, plus an inexplicable picture of Jesus in the garage. Apart from that little difficulty, the defence seemed moderately plain sailing. As I walked down to the Temple tube station some weeks later on my way home to Casa Rumpole, I saw a large figure flitting like some bloated white moth through the twilight along the embankment. It was Julius Kramer, jogging in a tracksuit. "Oh, Professor Kramer!" I called out, hoping for news of my son Nick in Baltimore. Nick and I were extremely close when he was a young lad. In fact, we formed some sort of unholy alliance against the constant attacks made by she who must be obeyed on our peace and privacy. Nick would stop her growing restive if I called in at Pomeroy's for a glass of Chateau Fleet Street on my way home, and I would do my best to frustrate her attempts to send Nick to the hairdresser or the dentist or some other unwelcome destination. We used to enjoy a good walk across Hampstead Heath, during which I would play Holmes and Nick Watson, and we would search for clues. Since Nick married an American girl, a young lady who indulged herself on an extremely dangerous diet of organic vegetation and iced water, and since he took up his lectureship in sociology, I had seen little of Nick, and, to be perfectly frank, I missed his company, and that instant rapport it seemed to me that we had when he was about 10 years of age. "Professor Kramer!" I called again, but my voice was lost in the shadows, the cry of the seagulls and the roar of the traffic, and the large man trundled out of view. When I got home, I was amazed to find that she who must be obeyed not only smiled at me in a way which was clearly meant to be welcoming, but she also sat me down in front of the glowing plastic coal of our electric fire, pushed a footstool towards my legs, and actually poured me a generous G&T. "Are you tired, dear?" she asked solicitously. "Are you feeling quite well, Hilda?" I was puzzled enough to ask. "A day in court is so hard for a man of your age. Daddy always said it was such physical labour standing up in court." "Well, perhaps that's why your daddy always sat down so remarkably quickly, particularly if anybody raised the subject of bloodstains. He couldn't stand the mention of blood, your daddy." "Look at the danger to your health, Rumpole," Hilda continued, unperturbed. "Yes, I know, it's like bloody mountaineering. You take your life in your hands in the law. There's always the risk of falling down the last 2 steps of the gents in Pomeroy's wine bar. Anyway, Rumpole, you won't want to die in harness. You know, poor Daddy died in harness." "Oh, really? I thought he died in the Tunbridge Hospital." At which point she produced a bag full of fluffy white knitting wool, and the room was filled with the unusual click of needles. "Rumpole, you must take things seriously," warned the gloomy tricoteuse. "You don't want to drop dead in court." I suppose she was right. I didn't fancy the idea of pegging out in the unconcerned presence of Mr. Justice Vosper. Well, harness may be all right, but dying in a wig. To introduce a less depressing topic, I asked she what garment she was constructing, or was it perhaps bed socks? "It's for Mrs. Erskine Brown's baby. Your Miss Phillida Trant, as was, that nice girl in your chambers. She'll have to give up the bar now she's got the baby." Birth and death, they silence us all in the end. "What are you knitting for it, a dust sheet?" "No, a matinee jacket." "Oh, I forgot. It's a letter for you." "Will the baby go to many matinees?" I asked, but it didn't get a laugh. Instead, she handed me the letter, which announced that it came "from the desk of Professor Julius Kramer of Baltimore University," and continued, "Dear Mr. Rumpole, your name has long been known to us as a legal luminary. We would wish to invite you, and of course your good lady, to visit us on campus during the autumn semester, and deliver a series of lectures on the alienation factor in the psychological aspects of owner deprivation." "What does that mean, Rumpole?" "Owner deprivation? Presumably nicking things." "It's from Baltimore University," Hilda reminded me quite unnecessarily. "Nick's University? What a coincidence!" There was a further coincidence. Later that evening the phone rang, and my son Nick's voice came to me, not frozen by the Atlantic breakers, but clear as a bell. He was flying over to England, it seemed, on university business, and would stay with us. I was, of course, delighted. It was going to be like the old days, when he came up for half-term and visited the Old Bailey to listen to one of my murders. Always so much more suitable, I thought, than the cinema. He would come and watch my performance in court. I'd give him lunch. Life was distinctly improving. The prosecution of Uncle Percy Timpson was in the hands of that recent father and married man, Claude Erskine Brown. As we gathered outside Court No. 2 in the Old Bailey, my heart sank. Once again the wheel of fortune had spun and turned up a disaster for the gambler Rumpole. The case was to be tried by Mr. Justice Vosper. As I stood reeling under this blow, Erskine Brown came bustling up and showed me the photograph of a somewhat elderly-looking baby. In fact, it looked even older than I felt. "It's an extraordinarily talented baby for its age," Erskine Brown boasted. "It has an amazingly powerful grip." "Yes, well, that'll be for hanging onto its mother's tail as they spring from bough to bough," I said, forgetting at the moment that the mother was one of my learned friends. Erskine Brown put away the photograph reluctantly. "I think it has a remarkably intelligent look. I can't get Philly to see it." "Yes, quite remarkable. Any day now it should be picking up a few briefs in the Chancery Division," I assured him. Rumpole, you're not being serious." "Perfectly serious. With an expression like that we might find it a place on the circuit bench. I shouldn't be at all surprised." Erskine Brown looked at a bench-load of stolid, well-fed and dishonest citizens, the Timpson family, who had come to lend comfort and support to their Uncle Percy. I recognized Noreen and such old clients as Fred, Dennis, Cyril, and Fred's wife, Vi Timpson. The men were smartly dressed in blazers and flannels. The women had elaborate perms. "Are those all your witnesses?" Erskine Brown asked, as the clan Timpson gave me warm smiles of encouragement. "Oh, no, my client's family. They're the sort to breed from, the Timpsons. Their activities have kept me in work for years." This isn't a fight, is it?" Erskine Brown asked, as we moved into court. "Oh, my dear Erskine Brown, Claude! Well, shall we say just a little skirmish? But the picture was in your garage, and you signed a confession." "Yes, that means I start with a considerable handicap, which is probably fair, considering the difference in our form." I told him that with an optimism I hardly felt. Erskine Brown looked disappointed. "I was hoping for a quick plea. You see, I rather like to get back in time for the afternoon feed." "Oh, really? You indulge in a high tea, Erskine Brown?" "Oh, no, not my feed, the baby's." Among the prosecution witnesses, Erskine Brown called a Mr. Rowland, a man with a bald, skull-like head, who was, it seemed, an art expert. "I would say that work is quite priceless," Rowland told Erskine Brown, pointing to the picture in the well of the court. "But if you had to name a figure, how can you put a price on beauty?" The death's head appealed to the allegedly learned judge. "It has been done in the past, Mr. Rowland, by some quite well-known ladies." Oh, dear, we were all most amused by his lordship's little jokes. There was obedient laughter in court. "Oh, then, shall we say $250,000? Mr. Rowland dropped his bombshell, turning poor old Uncle Percy, the small-time fence, into a major criminal. Pounds, not dollars." Uncle Percy looked about to faint dead away, and the rest of the Timpsons were still whistling under their breath as I rose to cross-examine. "Mr. Rowland, You say that this is an undoubted painting by Taddeo di Bartolo. I waved in a casual manner at Our Lord, which had been made Exhibit 1. A nicknamed Il Zoppo, the Lame One. I gave him back his learning. A Sienese master of the 14th century. The Quattrocento. The Quattrocento, I'm obliged. And it is a good example of the master's work. I would say an excellent example. Mr. Rowland gave me what might have been a smile, had it appeared on a living face. Il Zoppo, the Lame One. Is he a painter well known to the general public? I asked politely. Oh, he is extremely well known to connoisseurs. Oh, I'm sure he is. I just wondered if his work was instantly recognizable by the crowd who get in the King's Elm on a Saturday night. My lord! Erskine Brown had risen to his hind legs, protesting. I ignored him. Well, what's the answer? I should imagine probably not. And, I went on at increased volume to drown any interruption, any drinker in the saloon bar who did recognize Il Zoppo's work and wanted to buy it would have to be provided with £500,000 in his hip pocket to complete the transaction. My lord, I really don't know what the relevance of these questions is, Erskine Brown bleated, and then sat down exhausted. I picked up Uncle Percy's signed confession and looked at it in disgust. The relevance, my lord, is that in his so-called voluntary statement Mr. Timpson said he proposed to flog the artwork up the King's Elm next Saturday night. Even judicial knowledge, my lord, must encompass the fact that the King's Elm is not Sotheby's. The judge, however, gave me a brisk return. And even your extensive knowledge of crime, Mr. Rumpole, he said, must encompass the possibility that your client himself had no idea of how valuable the painting was. So, with the score at 15 all, a small diversion was caused by Henry bringing my son Nick Rumpole into court, and finding him a seat behind me. Nick had arrived the night before and gone to bed before we had more than a couple of jars, a short chat, and some coloured slides of his lovely home, his wife Erica, the swimming pool, and a number of visiting academics cooking a meal on some sort of open fire, although I assumed the house had a reasonably equipped kitchen. Nick had kept his promise to come down to the Bailey for a morning's entertainment and a spot of lunch, and I thought, as I turned to look at him, how extraordinary it was that he was so large. I always think of Nick as a solemn boy in a school blazer, sitting in silent fascination in the back row of a murder. However, I was resolved to give my son an entertaining day at the Bailey, and I entered with enthusiasm into the mano a mano with Detective Inspector Broom. I was asking the officer about the call he had had from Mr. Bernard, my instructing solicitor. He smiled tolerantly at the jury, as if to warn them that we were now coming to the suspect evidence of bent lawyers, and lied effectively. Mr. Bernard did not ring me, he said. Mr. Bernard will say that he did. I expect he will. A nudge, nudge, wink, wink at the jury. And that he was denied access to his client. Oh, does he say that? Broom sounded bored. You told him that Percy Timpson couldn't see a solicitor. No. Would you have allowed Percy Timpson to see a solicitor at the time this precious document was signed? No, I would not. I turned and gave Nick a quick smile and got his nod of approval. Then I re-attacked the witness. So if Mr. Bernard had telephoned, he would have been refused access? Yes. Why? No doubt you were still making your inquiries, were you not, Inspector? Mr. Justice Vosper supplied the answer. That is so, my lord, said Broom. Can you explain, officer, why Mr. Percy Timpson should have signed this confession in the absence of his solicitor? I don't know, Mr. Rumpole. People sometimes tell the truth. Broom was delighted by his answer. In the absence of their solicitor. And people sometimes want to protect their wives, don't they, Inspector? Oh, I suppose they may. The D.I. sounded less happy. You know my client has been married to his wife Noreen for almost 30 years. Are you putting your client forward as a perfect husband, Mr. Rumpole? The judge weighed in, no doubt sensing danger. "No, my lord, merely as a loving husband." This shut his lordship up for a moment, and I turned to the witness. "Did you tell Percy Timpson that you had his wife downstairs in the station?" It's possible. I can't remember. I do have other cases, you know, Mr. Rumpole," the witness answered carelessly. "Did you say she was in the station?" I pressed him. "I may have done. Why did you lie to my client, Inspector?" "I didn't lie to him." The bizarre suggestion that police officers are ever less than 100% truthful appeared to have disconcerted the witness. "Why did you tell him that Noreen had been brought into the station and charged?" "I expect I said it because I intended to do exactly that," Broom said, as though that explained everything. "You intended to charge her?" "Yes." "Why did you change your mind?" "What? Oh, you never did charge her, did you?" "Well, there was no need to after... No need to after Percy had signed his statement. Is that what you mean?" I saw the jury look at Broom as if some of them were beginning to doubt the doctrine of the infallibility of the police. No need to after that, no," Broom admitted. "After he'd fallen into your trap, the bait could be thrown away. You'd got what you wanted, hadn't you?" "What had I wanted?" The defensive position didn't suit D.I. Broom. "An untrue confession, signed in the hope of saving his wife from the unwelcoming gates of Holloway Prison." It was clearly the moment for his lordship to come to the prosecution's rescue, and he did so with some skill. "Mr. Rumpole—" The politeness from the bench was icy. "Yes, my lord." "Aren't you forgetting something? This admirable example of Italian Renaissance art was actually found in your client's garage. Isn't that the point?" At which he gave the jury a meaningful look. "Yes, members of the jury, shall we say 2:05? "Well, isn't that the point, Dad?" Nick and I were enjoying a sustaining steak pie with boiled cabbage, washed down with a pint of draught Guinness in the pub opposite the Bailey. On a corner table the Timpson men were consuming brown ales and buying snowballs for their ladies, and in the middle distance the officers in charge of the case were scoffing harp lagers and cold sausage. "But I mean, if he's guilty anyway," Nick continued to cross-examine his father. "If he's guilty anyway, why bother to squeeze a confession out of him?" I looked across at the Timpson table. "You see, Nick, I know the Timpson family. Their activities paid your school fees for years. They never sign confessions." "Aha! You'll be able to lecture on that." Nick was laughing. "Lecture?" I didn't follow his drift. "You met Julius Kramer." "Oh, was that your doing, Nick?" For the first time I got a sniff of some kind of plot. "Oh, you must come to Baltimore, really. There's a lot of room in the new house. Erica would be thrilled to have you." "Oh, well, if I can get away." I was doubtful. "Oh, of course you can get away. You've really got to get away." "Got to?" "Well, Ma says you've been so tired lately." Nick was looking at me, concerned. At which moment D.I. Broom was passing us on his way back to court, and he stopped for an unfriendly chat. "Enjoying the pantomime, Mr. Rumpole?" he asked. "Is that what you call it?" "Well, don't you?" "No, I call it a trial, based on the quaint old-fashioned notion that a man's innocent until you prove him guilty." "Oh, come on, sir. You know Percy Timpson's been a fence for years." On which parting shot he left. I finished my Guinness and lit a small cigar. "Detective Inspector Broom," I mused. "The new Broom. Trials are just an unnecessary interruption in his fearless battle against crime." "Yes, but all the same—" Nick sounded doubtful. "All the same what, Nick?" "Well, it's not as if it was one of the murders you used to take me to. I mean, they were serious cases." "Ah, yes. You enjoyed those murders, didn't you, Nick?" "I mean, if Percy Timpson really is a professional fence—" "Oh, yes, he is quite professional." Nick looked at me. He was smiling gently. "Well, then, why bother, really?" he said. The Timpson case proceeded slowly. We kept having days off due to the fact that Mr. Justice Vosper was dividing his time between us and a government committee on the treatment of the young offender. Meanwhile, a deep-laid plot was going on involving my wife, Nick, and the mysterious Professor Kramer, of which I had no more than an inkling. I only learned months later that Mrs. Erskine Brown, Miss Phillida Trant in real life, had been invited for tea in Gloucester Road, had gone there, received the matinee jacket on behalf of the baby, and had been involved in the following conversation concerning the future of Rumpole. "I really wonder you had time to come over to tea," Hilda began obliquely. "What with the baby?" "Oh, I had a day off court, so Claude's holding the fort. Actually, he enjoys it." "Rumpole's not having a day off. He's gone for a conference in Wandsworth. Well, he's doing far too much for a man of his age." "He looks tired," Nick told Phillida. "Don't you think so?" "Oh, I think he looks, well, just as usual. He's desperately tired. We just can't wait to get him away." "Get Rumpole away? Where to, exactly?" "America." "I want them both to come and live with me in Baltimore," Nick said. "You want Rumpole to give up the bar?" Mrs. Erskine Brown was astonished. "Well, to retire. Everyone retires, don't they?" "Oh, everyone, possibly, but Rumpole—" Clearly, Chambers had never considered the possibility. "He's not immortal, you know. Rumpole's hardly immortal. Anyway, not a word to him at the moment. We're luring him across the herring pond by an offer of lectures in Nick's university," Hilda told her. "I've got him an offer from one of our professors," said Nick. "He's going to lecture on law." Nick revealed the full details of the plot. "Rumpole on law?" Apparently my learned friend Miss Trant sounded incredulous. "Well, really, Miss Trant, surely he knows about the law." Hilda bridled a little. The way Mrs. Erskine Brown answered her wasn't entirely flattering, but no doubt it contained a certain amount of truth. "Oh, hardly anything. Oh, he could lecture on how to tear up paper in the prosecution speech, or how to trick his opponent into boring the court with a lot of unnecessary cases. That's the one he played on me when I first started. He knows all about how to cross-examine and which members of the jury to get on his side. But if you ask my honest opinion, Rumpole doesn't know anything about the law. Oh, but it's only the bait for getting him over. And I put this flat on the market. So we'll have a little money, and living with Nick." Hilda seemed to see no problems. "I'm sure once he sees the house he'll stay," Nick said. "Nick has a swimming pool, he was telling me, and a sort of camp-fire." "Barbecue, Mother." "Oh, is Rumpole tremendously keen on swimming?" Their visitor was doubtful. "Well, if you ask me, he's bored to tears with the sort of cases he's doing nowadays." Nick seemed to have no doubt about the matter. "An obvious receiver. And the defence is, he didn't do it because he's finished the last job and was preparing for the next. Now, how could that interest anybody?" "Oh, I'm not sure. Miss Trant, as was, knew me, I'm sad to say, perhaps better than my son. Oh, Dad's in a hopeless position with the judge and the police dead against him." "Oh, are they? Oh, well then. I know exactly how he's feeling." "Yes, pretty depressed, I imagine." Nick supplied his answer, but the lady lawyer had hers. "I should think by now he's just starting to have fun." The conversation at that tea-time was, as I say, unknown to me for many months, and unconscious of my consignment by my nearest and dearest to the scrap-heap of rusty and worn-out barristers, I was, in fact, having a certain amount of quiet pleasure in pursuing a line of inquiry with that well-known expert on stolen art treasures, Mr. Melvyn Glassworth, whom I had gone to visit in Wandsworth, ostensibly to discuss the matter of his appeal. "Screws treating you all right, are they?" I asked him as we met among the pot plants of the prison interview room, and offered him a small cigar. "Oh, some of them are rather sweet. But you've got to get me out of here, Mr. Rumpole. I'm sorry I was a bit irritable last time." "Well, I'd be a bit irritable if I'd just got 3 years," I assured him. "You can get me out, Mr. Rumpole. I know you can." "I have been considering your appeal," I started judicially. "Oh, I hope to God you've come up with a few bright ideas." "I have found at least 10 places in which the judge misdirected the jury as to our defence." "Oh, Then you'll tell the Court of Appeal for me. You will, won't you, Mr. Rumpole? I may not be able to take your case on, Mr. Glassworth. I sound a doubtful. Pressure of other work. But if you found 10 good points... Well, he's duty-bound, isn't he, Mr. Bernard? The plump man, paler but no thinner since his conviction, looked appealingly at my instructing solicitor. I'll have to see. I paused and then said casually, Meanwhile, perhaps you can help me, as an expert in stolen artworks. An expert? Me? Well, I suppose I am. What do you want to know? A very valuable painting might be too well known to dispose of, I made a guess. Oh, you get that trouble, yes. Yes, it's hopeless trying to flog a Goya, for instance. Or a Taddeo di Bartolo, nicknamed Il Zoppo, I inquired casually. Ah, they're never charging me with that one, are they, Mr. Rumpole? Me? Mr. Glassworth was appalled. No, not as yet. I looked at him speculatively. What would you do if you had a well-known Di Bartolo? The Benediction, for instance. Oh, well, you'd never sell it. Too well known. No, I agreed, but what would you do? You mean, what would whoever had purloined such an artwork do, Mr. Rumpole? My art expert was cautious. Yes, exactly. Dump it. Melvyn Glassworth had no hesitation. Really? Oh, the only thing to do with it, of course. Oh, it might pay you to let the insurance company know where it got left. Dump it, I wondered. In what sort of place, exactly? Oh, somewhere anonymous, I suppose. Somewhere that couldn't be connected with you. Municipal rubbish tip? Has that ever been used? Oh, it has been known. Look, about this appeal. It's bloody impossible in here. Can't get a decent shampoo. I wash my hair daily, me. I promised to deal with his appeal. He had given me a little help with Percy Timpson's case, but I got a lot more assistance when I was met at the prison gates by Mrs. Vi Timpson, on her way to pay a family visit to her brother Charlie, who had just got 2 years for carrying housebreaking implements by night. Vi said she wanted an urgent word in my ear in private, so I sent Bernard walking up the road and withdrew with her to a corner of the prison wall. I'll never forget, Mr. Rumpole, she started, how you got my young Jim out of that nasty robbery at the butcher's. Oh, yes, of course. How is Jim? Oh, doing very well, Mr. Rumpole. Oh, yes, thank you. He's got his own little window-cleaning firm now. Oh, dear, I'm sorry to hear it. Window-cleaning is, of course, the best way to reconnoitre promising felonious entries. The thing is, I want to tell you, Vi burst out, I never agreed with what the family done to Uncle Percy. What the family did? I frowned, bewildered. Poor old Auntie Noreen, she's up the wall about it. Wasn't all the family, exactly. It was Dennis, mainly. You know Den was hopping mad when Percy let all that rubber-back carpet go for £20. The words were rushing out of her. I put a calming hand on her arm. Mrs. Timpson, Vi, perhaps you'd better tell me all about it. The family plot, or put Rumpole out to grass movement, gathered impetus in the next few days. Mrs. Erskine-Brown, the baby's mother, told Erskine-Brown, the father, presumably when they met briefly over the dried milk tin, that Rumpole was on the verge of retirement. Erskine-Brown told Guthrie Featherstone, QCMP, and our learned head of chambers met Mr. Justice Vosper, who was having a drink with his tall, lanky, and singularly unattractive son Simon in their club, the Sheridan. What had happened then was also something I did not discover until much later. Simon's just finishing his pupillage, the judge told Featherstone. Naturally looking for a seat in chambers, aren't you, Simon? Yes, Daddy, said Master Vosper, whose legal experience consisted in sitting next to his father on the bench and industriously sharpening his pencils. There might be a vacancy, Judge. Featherstone was anxious to help. Apparently Rumpole's retiring. He's going to live with his son in America. Rumpole retiring? The judge thought this scheme over, and so Featherstone told me later approved of it. can't be too soon for me. I've got him before me at the moment. Rumpole simply hogs the limelight. Hopeless case. But you can't stop the fellow fighting. Whilst Featherstone was selling my birthright to Master Simon Vosper in the Sheridan Club, I was entertaining the Timpson family, all except Noreen, who had gone to deliver a clean shirt and an ounce of golden bar to Percy in the cells, to tea in the cafe opposite the Old Bailey. As Vi sorted out beverages, I called the meeting to order. "I wanted to discuss with you, as members of the family," I said, "your Uncle Percy Timpson's defence." "Yes, Mr. Rumpole. Has that got 2 lumps, dear?" Fred was pleasantly cooperative. "Well, we rely on you, Mr. Rumpole." Cyril smiled. "Oh, the Timpson family has always been able to rely on Mr. Rumpole," Dennis assured me. "Yes, but can Mr. Rumpole rely on the Timpson family?" "Mine's the lemon tea, Vi," Dennis said, and asked me, "What do you mean exactly, Mr. Rumpole?" "Well, as you well know," I explained, $500,000 nicker and artworks from the Italian Quattrocento are quite out of Uncle Percy's league. Therefore I shall have to put him into the witness box to explain exactly what his league is." "Oh, what do you mean, Mr. Rumpole?" For the first time Fred Timpson sounded uneasy. "I mean," I warned them, "Percy is going to tell the judge he disposed of 40,000 Green Shield stamps for you, Fred, and a couple of lorry loads of nylon tights for you, Cyril, and innumerable canteens of cutlery, and 25 yards of rubber-back carpet from the local Odeon for Dennis, as well as the electric blankets and the 3 freezer-loads of stolen scampi." "I ain't got no convictions," Dennis protested, breaking the appalled silence, and he had the grace to add, "Oh, thanks to you, Mr. Rumpole." "Oh, yes," I said. "And I understand you've even got a legitimate job now, Dennis. What is it?" "Den's a crane driver," Cyril said, "on the municipal muck heap." "On the municipal muck heap? Now, isn't that a coincidence?" I looked round the embarrassed family. "What do you mean, Mr. Rumpole?" "I mean that it was on a municipal muck heap that some far more cultivated villain than any of you dumped the benediction by Taddeo di Bartolo. Uncle Percy hasn't been doing too well as a fence lately, has he?" Not too brilliant, no," Freddie admitted. "Percy's past it." It was Dennis who said it. "Getting past it. I gave it to him then. Oh, I know. Letting your hard-won consignment of electric blankets go half-price. Gossiping away in pubs when some minor grass is listening. He got our lad Jim 6 months chattering away like that, Mr. Rumpole." Fred was deeply hurt. "Silly old fool," said Cyril. "He's a menace to everyone, is Uncle Percy," Dennis pronounced judgment. "Is that why you decided he ought to be retired?" I asked them, and was answered by a nasty silence. "You decided to put Uncle Percy out to grass," I went on. "Give him his cards. Rusticate him. Put him on the shelf. You all decided Uncle Percy was past it, didn't you, the whole family? So you wanted him to retire. Quickly." There was another lengthy and guilty pause. Then Fred Timpson made an admission. "We couldn't persuade Percy it was time to go, Mr. Rumpole." "Honest, he wouldn't listen to reason," Dennis protested. "The man was bloody dangerous carrying on at his age," Cyril told me. I gave them all a cold look and told them. "So Den with the clean record plants a picture on him and rings up D.I. Broom with the information." Hardly a golden handshake, was it? Not even a gold watch from the company. "The trouble with all of you is, you're none of you Bernard Berenson." "We're not what, Mr. Rumpole?" Fred was puzzled. "You're not even Lord Clark. You never studied civilization even on the telly. You couldn't tell a genuine Fra Angelico from the top of a box of biscuits. And because of your total abysmal ignorance of matters artistic, Uncle Percy's up on £500,000 handling and 3/4 of the way to Parkhurst, Isle of Wight." "Well, what are you going to do about it, Mr. Rumpole?" Dennis asked uncomfortably. "No, what are you going to do about it, Dennis?" I stood up and prepared to leave the assembled Timpsons. "You'd better think a bit quickly," I told him. "Uncle Percy is going to give his evidence tomorrow." By the time I got back to the flat, I was feeling low and somewhat exhausted. I sat by the electric fire alone in the dark, and was roused from a blackish reverie by Nick coming in and switching on the light. It seemed that she who must be obeyed was out on a visit to the fascinating Erskine-Brown baby. Nick looked at me in the way that relatives look at old people on hospital visits, with a sort of hushed concern. "A bad day in court." "Detective Inspector Broom," I said, "wants to reverse the burden of proof, revoke Magna Carta, and abolish barristers." Well, that might be all right. If only he could resist gingering up the evidence whenever it suits him. And there's no honour among thieves any more, Nick. I'm ashamed of the Timpson family. "I've always thought your job must be pretty depressing," Nick said briskly. "They wanted to get poor old Uncle Percy to retire, so the family cooked up the most diabolical plot. Oh, I don't know. I really don't know what things are coming to. A drop of G&T? I shuffled off to the reviving drinks table. "Yes, thanks." "Things have reached a low ebb, Nick. They've even got piped music in Pomeroy's wine bar. I have to come home now to avoid the crooner." How disgusting. At which I recalled the good old days when Nick was about 10. "Remember when we used to go for walks on the heath, Nick? I was Holmes and you were Watson. We used to pick up clues." Nick took his G&T, smiled, and entered into the spirit of the thing. "What's the explanation of this half-used box of matches on the path, Holmes?" he said in his Watson voice. "Someone's either got a hole in his jacket pocket, or he suddenly gave up smoking. You amaze me, Holmes." You can't go for a walk up on the heath now," I told him. "Not a decent Sherlock Holmes voyage of exploration. You keep tripping over the permissive society. I'll never forget those walks. It doesn't matter, we don't see so much of each other now, Nick. Doesn't matter in the least. Bound to happen anyway. People growing up and all that sort of thing." "Well, perhaps we can do something about it," he said. "Growing up?" "No, not seeing each other." "Look, honestly," Nick protested, "haven't you got into a terrible rut?" Matched with an aged wife, I meet and dole unequal laws unto a savage race," I started off. "And my son, God bless him, was on to Alfred Lord Tennyson like a terrier." "'Tis not too late to seek a new world," said Nick. "Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows." "You remember it, Nick?" I was delighted, and stood up in a determined manner. "For my purpose holds," I carried on, "to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die." "You are going to, aren't you?" Nick asked. "Die?" I said. "Of course not. Sail beyond the sunset. You're coming to Baltimore." It's a long way from the Old Bailey." I sounded doubtful. "Well, wouldn't that be a relief?" "Perhaps it might be." "Well, it's still on, you know, the lectures." "Ah, yes, the lectures. I saw Professor Kramer today. The only trouble is he's no longer at the Savoy. They've taken him into the Charing Cross Hospital. Nick broke the news to me as a matter of some seriousness. He collapsed while jogging." Oh, while jogging, eh? Well, I've always avoided exercise." I tried to look serious also. "Exercise is simply an invitation to death." When I turned up at the Bailey next day, I saw Guthrie Featherstone, QC.MP., robed for the court next door, in earnest conversation with my opponent, Claude, the family man. As I drew alongside, Featherstone broke off and looked, I thought, exceedingly shifty. "Morning, Erskine-Brown," I said. "Ready for the battle? I think we may have a little surprise for you today." Horace, are you free by any chance next Thursday evening?" Featherstone asked, in a casual sort of manner. "Free? I don't suppose so. I'll probably be at home with my wife." "We want Hilda to come too, and your son, of course. I believe he's over." "Come where?" I was puzzled. "I'm giving a little dinner at the club," Featherstone said. "The Sheridan. Most of the Chambers will be there. Pencil it in now, like a good chap." He went, and I turned to Erskine-Brown for clarification. "What's the matter with our learned head of Chambers?" I asked him. "Has he come into money?" A couple of hours later, that doughty advocate, Claude Erskine-Brown, was cross-examining Dennis Timpson, who had just given evidence on behalf of the defence. "Let me get this clear," Erskine-Brown asked with some scorn. You found the picture on the municipal rubbish dump? Where I work, yes. Dennis smiled at the jury, who were looking in turn at the exhibited depiction of our Saviour giving a £500,000 benediction. And you put it in your Uncle Percy's garage? I had a key. Percy lent me his Cortina when I went on holiday, Dennis explained patiently. You put it there at night, without telling your uncle what you'd done? Well, I did it quietly, like, not wanting to wake the old couple. Well, why store it in Uncle Percy's garage? Well, I didn't have no accommodation, did I? Not for a thing of that size at home. Mr. Timpson, asked the exasperated Erskine Brown, can you think of one reason why the members of the jury should believe this extraordinary story? Yeah. Dennis turned to the jury in a businesslike way. You see, members of the jury, I rang the local Nick that night. I said there was this picture light, and if they were interested, they could find it in Uncle Percy's garage. So they was here next morning with a dawn patrol. Erskine Brown sat down on this, and I saw him speaking to Henry, who had just come into court. I rose to re-examine with confidence. D.I. Broom had clearly been told by someone that there was something interesting in Percy's garage, and that informant was now revealed as Den. Who did you speak to at the local Nick? I asked. I spoke to D.I. Broom. He'll tell you that. We shall see if the prosecution recalls him to deny it. From the whispers from the officers in charge of the case, it seemed unlikely that they would. You told the detective inspector the picture was in your uncle's garage? Of course I did. But you never told your uncle. He remained in ignorance. Total ignorance, my lord, Dennis told the judge without hesitation. Yes, thank you, Mr. Timpson, unless your lordship has any further questions. The jury was out for 4 hours, and acquitted Percy Timpson by a majority. He went back to work to the great satisfaction of Noreen, and the resigned regret of the rest of the family. On the following Thursday I duly turned up with my wife and son at feeding time at the Sheridan Club. We penetrated the somewhat chilly portals, passed a somnolent and sleepy uniformed figure in a glass case, and went up a staircase to a fire-warmed hall, where I was delighted to see my old friend George Frobisher, now a circuit judge, and less delighted to see Mr. Justice Vosper and his lanky son Simon. I did my best to ignore the High Court judge, and greeted the inferior tribunal, His Honour Judge Frobisher. George, my old friend, my dear old friend, you come all the way from Hertfordshire. I was touched. To have dinner in your honour, Rumpole, of course I have. George smiled. I thought he was pleased to see me. I miss you at Pomeroy's, George. No friendly jar there when the day's work is over. I sat down for a moment on a nearby and inviting settee. That's the drawback of being a circuit judge, Rumpole. The work's over at tea-time. You're not even allowed to go to the pub. I say, Rumpole, you're not a member here, are you? Mr. Justice Vosper always had to have his 2 pennyworth. No, Judge, I don't believe I am. Well, you're sitting on the member's sofa. I suppose you plead ignorance? No, Judge, I plead exhaustion. But I had to move when an elderly waitress appeared and told us that Mr. Featherstone was receiving his guests in the small dining-room. So George and the Rumpole family set off in the direction she indicated, and arrived in a room hung with pictures of old actors, judges, and best-selling novelists, and found a table lit by candles and gleaming with old silver, with Guthrie Featherstone and all the other members of Chambers, including Henry and Diane from the clerk's room, chattering merrily and drinking sherry. I was surprised that my entrance produced a sort of awed silence. Then Guthrie Featherstone stepped forward with a welcoming, "Rumpole!" "Here he is, the guest of honour," said Erskine Brown. "Rumpole of the Bailey," his wife chimed in. "Rumpole, my dear fellow, Mrs. Rumpole and Nick, delighted you could come." Featherstone did the honours, and I heard Uncle Tom, our oldest inhabitant and non-practising barrister, whisper to Erskine Brown, "Are we feeding the entire Rumpole family?" "What is this, a wedding or a wake?" I asked the world at large, and then moved towards the smiling Erskine Browns. "The baby's left home, has it?" It's actually in its carry-cot with the lady downstairs, our Portia told me, and the proud father added, one of us will have to leave early to give it its 10 o'clock feed. One of us? I thought that his wife was looking at him in a meaningful manner. I also thought it was time to get off the nappy chat, so I said cheerfully, "Well, Erskine Brown, I thoroughly enjoyed our little scrap." "Oh, I suppose it's nice for you to go out on a win," Erskine Brown admitted, grudgingly. "Go out? Go out where?" I was puzzled. "Oh, you mean go out for dinner?" "I didn't enjoy our case much," Erskine Brown said. "I find these days I really prefer paperwork at home. Keeps one with the family." "And I love court," his wife was enthusiastic. "Of course, now there'll be such a lot of crime going spare in Chambers." "Oh, really?" I said. "Are you expecting a new outbreak of villainy?" Before I could fully understand Mrs. Erskine Brown's prophecy of extra work in Chambers, I heard a well-known and unloved voice say, "Rumpole." Oh, my God! I turned at the unwelcome sound. "Only our judge," Erskine Brown reassured me. What had happened was all too clear. Featherstone had invited Mr. Justice Vosper and his unlikely lad to dinner. "I think you know my son, Simon. He's endlessly grateful for the favour you're doing him. Aren't you grateful to Rumpole, Simon?" "Oh, of course I am, Daddy." I had no idea what particular kindness, if any, I had unintentionally done young Simon Vosper. Before I could ask for further particulars, the judge rattled on. "I say, that was an outrageous win you had today. Your client should have been potted." "Oh, really? I'm sorry you miscued," I said. "Miscued? Ha ha!" The judge laughed mirthlessly. "Funny, that. You'll probably have some outrageous wins too, Simon, as soon as you get your bottom onto Rumpole's chair." What on earth was he talking about? His son's bottom on my chair? Was Mr. Justice Vosper getting past it? Before I could inquire further, the antique waitress called us to the trough. "Come along, Rumpole," Featherstone called to me. "I've ordered pheasants, game, chips, and all the trimmings. The best that the Sheridan can offer." A couple of hours later, during which I had been speculating about a mysterious cardboard box in front of Featherstone's place, the learned head of our chambers beat on a glass with a spoon and rose to his feet to address the cigar-smoking, port-swilling company, who were all still present, save Erskine Brown, who had slipped away mysteriously after the pud. "Just a few words from me," said Featherstone. "Horace Rumpole has become part of our lives in Chambers, like a valued piece of antique furniture which we see every day and only notice, perhaps, and miss when it's gone." Well, that fell into the category of things that could have been put better, but I let him carry on, seeing that he was about to open the box in front of him. "But I hope, Horace, I sincerely hope that you and Mrs. Rumpole will accept this clock as a token of our affection and respect. May it tell many happy hours in the future." As the handsome timepiece was thrust into my hands, engraved as it was with the names of all the members of Chambers, including Henry and Diane, and as I fondled their gift, and as their voices were raised in asking for a speech in reply, the pieces of the jigsaw, as they say in detective stories, fell into place. I saw clearly that there had been a plot against me as ruthless and well-planned as the Timpson family's scheme to dispose of Uncle Percy. I was being retired, and their clock was my parting gift. I had little time to consider the participation of my wife and son in this conspiracy. My final speech was expected of me, and I gave it. "If your lordship pleases, Hilda, Nick, my friends, my old friends. This occasion has cheered me considerably." I drank port, and my audience smiled pleasantly. "There have been times lately during the long hours in your lordship's court," I went on, and Vosper J. called out, "Pretty long for me, Rumpole." However, I ignored the interruption. Listening to the constant attacks on our profession by the police, there have been times, I must confess, when I wondered if I hadn't been getting into some sort of rut. That's exactly what I've been thinking, I heard Nick whisper to George, and then I gave them the first whiff of Tennyson. Matched with an aged wife, I meet and dole unequal laws unto a savage race, that hoard and sleep and feed and know not me. Members of chambers all looked at Hilda in a friendly fashion, and she smiled and said, Really, Rumpole? In such moods, I must confess I have been tempted to chuck it all in, to retire, to go out to grass. Here I paused and looked around at them all gratefully. But your support, your affection, and above all this very generous gift, have made me change my mind. There was a moment's puzzled silence. But before they could ask a question, I had launched into the final great passage of the old laureate's Ulysses. "'Tis not too late to seek a new world," I told them. "Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset." "A new world?" George whispered to Nick. "Perhaps he's going after all." "Of course he is," said Nick. "And the baths of all the western stars, until I die," I went on, and I heard Hilda assure Mrs. Erskine Brown, "He's definitely going." "It may be that the gulfs will wash us down," I told them. "It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in the old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts." "It still makes a good final speech, old Rumpole." This was Featherstone muttering to Mr. Justice Vosper, to which the judge replied, "Goes on a bit long." "Made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." I paused. There was a smatter of applause. "Well, is that it?" Uncle Tom asked, but I had the final clear announcement to make. "This handsome timepiece will encourage me, my old friends," I told them, "to forget all thoughts of surrender and retirement, and not to yield in all my future cases at the Old Bailey, London Sessions, Luton Crown, or even before the Uxbridge magistrates. And I shall never be late. This will always get me to the court on time." I was standing holding the clock proudly, whilst the assembled company stared at me with mingled hostility and amazement, and at last Uncle Tom spoke to no one in particular. "If Rumpole's not retiring," he said, "does he really mean to hang on to our clock